Good afternoon and welcome to Pioneering Pensions. For those who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg and I have a passion for pensions. Today, our guest is Lisa Brüggen. She's a professor in Maastricht and the director of Netspar. Lisa's done a lot of work, a lot of studies, applied research on pension communication. And this is a very exciting topic because across the world, we have all the same biases, but the framing and the context is different. And Lisa has been studying a lot of communication in the Netherlands, but also abroad. So I think we will have a very good discussion now on pension discussion. So Lisa, I would like to wish you welcome to Pioneering Pensions.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Lisa. And before we start asking you questions, I just want to let everybody in the audience know that, we're here for you. And I'm going to have a conversation with Lisa for roughly half an hour. After that, we're going to open up the floor so all of you can ask your questions. But don't wait until at that period. When you have a question for Lisa during our conversation, just type it in the chat. And then we'll come back to them after half an hour. So with that, Lisa, I'm going to turn into the first question. I know that you started as a professor in marketing. What sort of got you interested in the pension problem or pension communication?
Yeah, very good question. I was indeed doing very different research years ago, but I really missed the societal relevance of what I was doing. And coincidentally, I did one project within the pension world, and I immediately loved it because it's societally so relevant. We all hope to get really old, and then we need income to live from. And another thing that I realized is that there were a lot of academics working in pensions, but very few with my sort of background. And I think there was a need to look at also the question from different perspective and look exactly at pension communication and member engagement.
Thank you, Lisa. And I remember, I think it must have been like 5, 6 years ago, you and I did something up in Sweden for the premium pension. And I know I needed someone who knew a lot about member communication and behavioral. So you were the natural choice. And what I remember from that was one thing that stuck with me was that what I learned from the research you did was that Swedes on average have a very good financial knowledge. They're very financially literate. But then when you ask them what they did with that, you realize they didn't use that when they made the decision. So just because you are financially literate doesn't mean you're going to apply that when you're thinking about pension. And I thought that was a very interesting insight for me. Lisa, when you looked at the data, what were the things that stood out to you?
Yeah, it was indeed a very interesting project. And what I recall is that we found that especially people who are very risk averse, they actually stayed with the default. And they must have seen this as kind of implicit advice. And what was fascinating was that the default was actually one of the most risky choices in the entire choice set. So there was clearly a mismatch between what they did or actually did not do by staying at the default and the risk preferences. And I think that also shows, and I guess we'll talk more about this later on, that when you set up these choice architectures, that it's really important to think it through and to also carefully think about the default and whether that's a good match with what the majority of people who may stick to the default also want.
Yeah, and I remember this was a big discussion when we were up there among the politicians as well. And I think that when I look back at it, I said I thought it was kind of a risky thing, but also when you see what happening in many pension funds is that the trustees might be quite risk averse and have a very too conservative mix as well. So it's really difficult to find the right mix. When I recalled from this, I think I asked you just for fun to say, if you took the results from this survey you've done and you showed the outcomes to your colleagues and you should ask them to guess which country was this.
They didn't get it right. They didn't get it right. And I think that's quite interesting because obviously there are a lot of regulatory differences between countries when it comes to pensions, right? But I think this challenge of member education, member engagement, member activation, choice guidance is really a universal one. That's also something we found in a qualitative research studies later on. We thought we would find a lot of differences between countries, but I think the challenge of really getting people to look into their retirement is actually rather universal.
So actually, this is one area where you really should look at other countries and don't be too worried that they have a different regulatory framework, because here you can learn from each other, because everywhere I look is very low take-up rate for pension communication. I was wondering, do we know why people are not interested in pensions? Have you done some research to sort of highlighting that question?
Yes, I have done some research on this myself, and there is also actually quite a bit of research already on what the underlying reasons are why people are not really looking into the retirement planning. And what makes it so challenging is that it's actually a number of reasons that play a role. So the first one is actually that retirement for most seems very far away, right? And there are always a lot of pressing problems also in the here and now. And so you always need to trade off these future gains and losses versus, current trade gains and losses. And then often people focus much more on the present rather than at the future. You already mentioned that financial literacy is a problem, and knowledge about pensions, about retirement plays a role. Many people, even if they understand it and they want to do something about it, they often lack the self-control to do something. Some people also have retirement anxiety, so they have very negative thoughts when they think about the future, or they really have a hard time imagining themselves in the future and relating to their own future self. So yeah, there are really a number of reasons that make it very challenging for people to get started with their retirement planning.
And that's, I assume, why we have in almost every country is kind of mandatory or quasi-mandatory to save for your pensions. And if people don't have that kind of thing in place, people don't seem to save. So it might be actually the most important part is to have the right legislative framework to actually get people on the path, because that's more important than anything else.
Yeah, maybe to quickly already respond to this. I think that's really a very good comment. I think if we talk maybe a little bit more about communication and how you could also improve the communication, I think the really crucial question that you should ask yourself is, what do I try to solve through communication or through better communication to really activate people, to engage them better? And what do I actually solve through scheme design or even through legislation? And I think it's a little bit like a funnel, right? If you actually have already the sort of good legislation in place and good scheme design that also accounts for lack of engagement, accounts for these behavioral biases that we know that exist, then of course that puts a lesser demand on communication compared to a scheme where it's all up to the individual and it's completely their responsibility to make sure that they sign up and select the right contribution rate and do everything to ensure a proper pension build-up.
And also, when looking into that, my experience as a practitioner is that it's very easy for the industry to feel that we need to solve this. Even if you have bad regulation and bad scheme design, you think you can solve that by communication, but sometimes you probably need to actually lobby the politicians to put the right condition in place, because it's only so much you can achieve with communication, right?
Yeah, that's a really good comment. I mean, communication about pension is very difficult because it's a complex matter, and it's hard to really explain it in a way that's understandable and accessible. And even if you do that, we just know from research that the take-up rate of communication is simply very low. And related to this, I think another challenge that I also often see is that unfortunately, the communication specialists are often only involved in a very late stage when everything has been decided. And then it's like, okay, now you go and communicate. And that's also very, very difficult. I think there would be so much to gain if they would be involved in a much earlier stage when certain decisions are taken, so that you also directly think it through, like, okay, how can we really explain the trade-offs or explain the decisions to the members, so that they also understand it, trust it, or engage in the behavior that you want them to engage in.
So ideally, we're saying when you do your scheme design, you should actually start with the communication and say, how can I get this out to my members, and then build something that sort of makes sense based on how you want to communicate it, rather than the other way around, which I think is what we do today.
Yes, yeah, you refer to my marketing background, and actually, so my background, consumer behavior and service design, and there you have a very customer-centric way of thinking, right? You really look at the individual and you think about, okay, what is it that they really need, and you indeed try to more or less build it around them. And that's also really something that surprised me in this pension domain, is that it's a very product-centric way of thinking. So this is what we do, this is what we have, this is the choices that you can make, and then you just sort of try to communicate about it and push it onto them. And I think that's really an issue. And even though I try to advocate now already for a while that the members should be placed much more in the middle of everything, I still regularly see examples when pension funds, for example, develop a whole new approach to choice guidance, and years of work, lots of people involved, high costs, and then at the very end they say, oh, and now we need to check what our members actually want. It's like, you should have started with that. And I think that's really something, I guess we'll also talk a little bit more about certain techniques in communication that you can use to improve it. But I guess what I want to say is that we also need more of a cultural change. And I think it's not sufficient that you have somewhere down in the organizations this knowledge about good pension communication. You also need to have it in the boards, and you also need to have commitment at that level, that members are important, and yeah, the communication to them is important. Because if you ask me, I think in the future that's really something that will become even more important, and yeah, really plays a crucial role.
So I want to test an idea with you then, because I've been working on developing a pension experience or pension solution, and we and my colleague David Bird, we started from scratch by thinking, how should this work? What's important to the member? And that includes everything from how you put it together. And our think was like, how do you frame pension for people? And we know that PLSA in the UK, they have a sort of a target on how much you're going to need in consumption at different retirement income levels. So we said, instead of just talking about how much money you have, would it be possible to say, you're going to get this amount of years of a certain retirement income if you continue to save and do what you're doing today. And we thought that was sort of a way of making it less complicated and less scary, and also more relevant to people. And I just wonder, what do you think about such an idea? And then we build everything around it.
So what I really like about this, I think, is that you reframe it from numbers, percentages, income projections to years, right? And I could imagine that that's maybe more tangible for people, and that it's a bit easier to relate to. So I think it could work. I would recommend you to do some research about it. But I think it's an interesting approach, and it also reminds me of one study that we're about to complete, but we already ran several studies about it. And there we also played with this idea, okay, a lot of the information is very number heavy, right? It's like, this is your contribution rate and this is your expected retirement income. But for people, it's often very hard to judge, okay, if I have a contribution rate of 10% or 15%. Now, is that, you know, good or moderate or very good, or, you know, where do I stand and what can I really buy from this? And so we also used actually these living standards and showed people, okay, with this contribution rate and this expected retirement income, you can, for example, go on vacation in Europe for 2 weeks versus, you know, a weekend in your own country, or this is sort of what you can really purchase from this. And we saw that that actually increases the mental imagery, so makes it much more vivid for people, and also increased their saving behavior. So it was, of course, in a lab study, but we also did one study in an incentivized manner, so that it's not just cheap talk. So these kind of visualizations can really help to increase savings towards retirement.
And I was thinking, if you're a provider and you kind of need to deal with the sphere of your influence, what would be your recommendations from a more practical perspective on sort of improving the pension communication?
I think the first principle is layering, 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 and keep it as simple as possible. I think there's always a tendency to overload people with all kind of information. It's also a bit the risk aversion and the lawyers that are really afraid if you don't say this and don't say that. And I think you should say everything. You should be really transparent, but you should dose it in the right way. We found in our research that if you have a first compact layer with information that people understand, then they often want to know more and are interested in learning more. But if you throw it at them all at once, they're like, oh my God, and then you lose them. So layering is important and keeping it simple. And if we think it's simple, you should make it twice as simple. So I think there was also a really great initiative by Nest Pensions in the UK. They have this dictionary where they defined all words that you can or cannot use. And I think these type of initiatives of really making it simple and easy to understand for people are super important. We showed in our research that framing really matters. So we have one field experiment where we just changed 4 headings in a newsletter, and we could double the response to the newsletter. So these small changes in the wording, they really matter. Making it more visual so that people can more easily relate. Maybe also the visuals you use. I remember sometimes, when one of my PhD students once started, she got a welcome newsletter from a pension fund, and on that brochure there was a 40-year-old fireman with a son, and that's so far away, of course, from where she stands and her age. And it's just these little things that, you know, if you just put someone younger there, that people can relate a little bit better and think, oh yeah, that's for me. that can make actually small differences, and use all the insights that are by now out there from behavioral economics and psychology about how to frame communication.
And I think what you're saying is something I've been thinking quite a lot about, is kind of personalization, because if it's about you and your savings, it's relevant to you. If it's a generic statement, well, it's not that interesting. Some people have an argument as well. They say it's difficult to get people interested, and some then apply this sort of clickbait thinking. So you're saying, well, young people might be interested in sustainability or ESG. So if we talk a lot about ESG, people will sort of read it, and then they're going to click on the link to get to the pension fund provider side. And then once they're in there, they're going to look around and get totally captivated by the amazing coolness of pensions, and therefore start reading about their pension. Some people actually argue for this quite strongly. I'm probably in the camp where I think it's probably not a great idea. Where do you stand?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, what I like about this thinking is at least that you try to understand, okay, who are my members and what is important for them? What do they care about? I do happen to know some pension funds who have members that really care about sustainability and find it very important. And they also see that if they have items about sustainability in their newsletter, more members click on these items than on other items. And so there it seems to work. I also know other pension funds where it's a very controversial topic, or the member base is so that they don't care that much about it. So I like the thinking, and I would always advocate know your member base, and also the research about it, what works and what doesn't work. But the better you can connect to what your members care about, possibly also to live events experience, where you can find these little hooks, where there's this small opportunity that you can talk to them about pensions. I think you need to use these to really connect to your members.
One of those hooks is probably, you change job and therefore you change your pension provider, and then you have this little span of attention where you can get them. And if you do it in the right way, you might actually get their interest. And if you do it in the wrong way, they're just going to scroll on, right? So you have to be very careful when you do your communication there, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have to wait 7 years until they shift jobs another time. I was wondering as well, because I think it's really important to understand your member, as you say. And I know in the Netherlands, the regulator has quite strong requirements. So they want pension funds to measure the ESG preferences of the members, and they want to measure the members' risk preference. And having a bit of background trying to quantify things. And for me, to take risk preference, which is sort of, for me, that's very closer to an emotion. It's very dependent on the framing. It's very dependent on how I feel. It's dependent on what I've done recently. So the question is this, it's nice from a theoretical perspective, but if you're going to measure it, can you really measure it? And if you can't do that in a good way, isn't this sort of just making it really, really difficult for a pension fund to actually do meaningful communication?
Yeah, good question. Actually, this is also a topic that gets a lot of attention in our Netspar research agenda. There have been several projects about this, and also industry publications recently. So anyone interested to learn really more about in detail, then I would recommend having a look there. You're right. There are lots of different ways to actually measure risk preferences and also sustainability preferences. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And I think we also know by now that they do not necessarily correlate very well with each other. Some of these methods you can actually translate, because you really sort of derive the utility function, and you can actually transfer that also, for example, to your investment policy. But the challenge there is that these ways to ask it are also rather difficult to really administer to members. So it's actually an approach where I myself have a tougher time understanding the questions. These are these long choice lists that members have to fill in. And so in short, all have their advantages, disadvantages, challenges. Should you then still measure it or abandon it? That has, of course, led to huge discussions also in the Netherlands. I think I'm still in favor of measuring it, knowing that what you get out is not perfect. And the reason why I'm still favoring it is because I think it forces the pension funds, it forces the board to again think about the members and what they want. And I think you also really saw this the last years, is that all of a sudden the members and their voices gets more attention also at these levels. And I think that's something that I really, really like about doing this, and then doing your best to translate this into your policies.
Thank you, Lisa. Our previous guest, Professor Jacob Benheim, he was focusing quite a lot about the info gap theory, how to make decisions when you have incomplete information. So this kind of links to this. And he had a question for you, but instead of me repeating the question, let's roll the tape.
How do you communicate to an audience that is not trained technically to deal with the issues that you want to transmit? This is a critical question when one wants to make the transition from the analytical to the decision-making stage. And that decision-making stage might be a bank president, but the decision-making stage might be the ordinary homeowner, the man on the street or the woman on the street. How can academics explain their ideas to people who don't have the technical background?
Good question. You know, and I think that's also something that you see in the industry, is that this is a very technical industry, and we use a lot of jargon, and if we have a conversation among each other, it's a different conversation than conversation that you can have with members. Actually, we recently organized a large event for members of colleagues at Tilburg University. And we didn't even use the word pensions in the title of the event or in the announcement or in the communication. We used the Dutch saying, which translates very awkwardly in English into, have you arranged your apple for your thirst? I guess it would mean something, have you taken care of your nest egg, or have you taken care of your rainy day or your pension planning, essentially. And in that event, what we actually said is that really break it down to the basics, you know, don't make it too complicated. It's about what do you want in the future, and what you need in the future, what do you want after retirement, where do you stand now, and if there is a gap, what can you really do about this? And I think you really need to this is sort of the level to really connect to them. And I think at least there it seemed to work. We had also younger people in the audience, not just people closely before retirement who, what we see in our research, are normally more interested in pensions, and you reach them a bit easier through your communication. But again, thinking about what's important to the audience.
I think that's very good to think about, and I hear you saying make it simpler, and I'm fully on board with that. Everybody talks about artificial intelligence, and everybody talks about technology. It's going to save all our problems, and I was wondering how much of that sort of the boundary between technology and the human touch, because how do you find a good balance there in pension? Because I think you need that. But what's your experience when you start thinking about technology and how it works? Have you done some research on that?
Yeah, actually, it's a coincidence. I didn't know that beforehand, but today a field experiment from us was published on the Netspar, a website about exactly that question. And we did a study where one group only received tooling in their choice guidance. So we targeted people who are about to retire within the next 5 years. And they have to take a decision about the way in which they want to draw down their accumulated pension. And we guided them to the tooling, with the tooling, through the choices that they can make. In the second group, they had the same tooling, but then there was a group session in which they could ask questions about the tooling. Not so much content questions, but much more about, do I see it right? Do I have to click there? Is that really what I see there? Some of these type of questions. And in the third group, it was again the same tooling in a one-on-one session with a financial advisor. And then we looked at which choices did people make, and we also asked them to fill out a questionnaire in which we asked them all kind of questions. And you do see that this combination between tooling and tooling has advantages, right? It's very scalable. You can much more easily actually bring all the relevant information together. People can also access it whenever they want and wherever they want, but they also really value the personal connection and the conversation. So they find the session more valuable, they learn more. Like a lot of these variables, this session scored much better. And maybe the most relevant finding to me was that in that condition with the advisor, not only did they make less standard choices, but after the session, they judged their own knowledge as significantly lower than in any of the other sessions. And I think it's more of a sort of realistic recalibration that only by talking to the advisor, they realize what they don't know, what they should know actually to make the good decision. And I think that's really, really crucial, because that's a decision that they make once and determines their income during retirement for the rest of their life. And so if you ask me, I really believe in this combination between tooling to make it scalable, to try to reduce costs, to have this accessibility advantage, but to also have a connection to a pension consultant, financial advisor, a good call center. I think there are a variety of ways in which you can fill this in, but I really believe in this combination.
And have you seen one of the organizations you've been doing research with, have you seen anyone using artificial intelligence in a sort of clever way, where it's kind of really useful and still keep the human touch?
We had an event a couple of weeks ago called AI and Choice Guidance and Pension Communication. We shared academic research on this topic, but also a couple of practice presentations. So you see, for example, initiatives that AI, so it's a lot kind of ChatGPT based type of large language models that are used to simplify letters. There are lots of initiatives in this area. I think it's also quite interesting, because I think this is good, but you probably also don't want to leave it to ChatGPT to make sense of the letters you write. So you better want to keep some control of what they make out of it, or even learn and make your own letters better. There were also some nice examples where AI is used, for example, in a call center. And when people call, that first of all, it's already clear, okay, what were previous questions, what has been said, but also what they may be asking, or when they ask, to directly draw in the right information from the knowledge base. So all call centers, all pension funds have probably some kind of knowledge base where all the details about the rules and regulations are stored, but they tend to be very complex, and it tends to cost a lot of time also to really go through and find sort of the exact details. And that was a very nice application where they also still had the human in control. So the AI was more the support, and it was still the human in control. But it was a nice way where I could see that it could help to better and quicker answer the questions, and at the same time also to bring down call time and hence costs for a pension provider.
I think that sounds really exciting, particularly if you can personalize it, so the person sitting there see, well, you have this amount of money. And yeah, I think that could be quite a nice thing.
Maybe if I could add one thing, Stefan, because I'm also a really big fan of human-centric design. And I think just one thing I really want to stress here is that also these approaches, you really need to put the member centric, but also think about the ethical implications of technology in AI. And I want to stress this because this sector, the lawyers, typically, that's all sort of checked, but this is new technology. The legislation runs behind. The ethical challenges, I think, really deserve attention, because if things go wrong, that can also really have severe consequences.
And I think you also have the moral obligation. So Richard Thaler, he typically signed his book with nudge for good, because you can also use it for not so good intentions. And I think with pension is really important, because it's people's money, it's part of the social security, and we need to do it in a way that works for members first and foremost. With that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions actually from the audience, because I had a couple of more things I want to ask you, but hey, I need to let the people who type the questions, a lot of them in here now. So let's kind of start going through them, and I will read them up and you can answer them, and trying to be relatively to the point on them so we can cover a lot of ground. So here's a question from David. It says, so great that you're on Pioneering Pensions. In the UK, we hear a lot from the industry about how financial education is the answer to the engagement gap with pensions. Do you agree with that? Question mark.
Short answer, no. But a little bit more explanation. No, financial education is important. There has been one meta-analysis. So meta-analysis is where they basically combine lots and lots and lots of studies that have looked at financial education. And in that meta-analysis, they actually found that the effects of financial education are very small and not very long lasting. Then a bit later, there was another meta-analysis, and they said, but if we take the proper studies that really do proper field experiments with proper control groups, actually they did find an effect. And I would also definitely say that financial education is important, but I think it's definitely not enough. And I think there are limits to as far as you can go and get really with this financial education. And another concern is that I have is that very often, and I see that a lot in research in this domain, they take this concept of financial literacy, but they often only really operationalize it as financial knowledge. So then you ask people whether they know about compound interest or that stocks are riskier than bonds. But I think that's not necessarily the type of knowledge you need to have for good retirement planning, right? It's also what is even my problem? Where do I find trustworthy sources? Where do I even need to look? Who can really help me? You know, it's different. It's maybe more financial skills that I consider important rather than the pure knowledge side of things. So I would say both are important. Keep investing it, but also knowing that there are limits and try to tackle that in other ways.
So financial street smartness is what we should have on the school agenda. I have a question from Julie. She says, in the UK, we saw a big workplace pension enrollment, the auto enrollment in 2014. And she says, I have employees who are point blank not interested and opt out every 3 years, despite the business making a free contribution. And I know they don't have a private pension. I just wondered what our country was trying to achieve. Certainly not what they thought they would. 16% do not pay into a workplace pension. So I think that's a pretty stark comment on sort of the auto-enrollment reform from someone who is an employer. What was sort of your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think you rightfully point out to very worrying situations. So essentially these 16%, then they don't have a second and what we call a third pillar pension and probably live, unless they have other wealth, but that's probably just a very, very few of that share really may actually run into problems at retirement. And that's an individual problem, but of course it's also a societal problem, right? It makes demands on social support, it affects consumption and hence also on macroeconomic factors. And that's really challenging to do something about, because the sort of opt-out is already I think a really good decision to make something opt out rather than opt in, because we know that then more people stick to that. The only thing that you can still try to do is that you use again insights from behavioral economics and psychology to make this opt out really, how should I say, as challenging as possible, and make sure that really people really understand what that means if they don't have it. And that is sometimes, I don't know, some commercial companies, when you sometimes want to book a flight and you don't want all these stupid extra insurances, but I really doubt whether that's what people really need. They make it really hard for you to really stick to your no that you don't need it. And then I'm really sometimes concerned about the nudging, like, is that really in people's best interest? But I think here, having a clear idea of what probably for most people would be the better decision to take, really make use of these principles to try to reduce this number as much as possible. But I do admit that it's challenging.
And I would say, based on what you said earlier, Lisa, I think it might actually be a good idea for Julie and her colleagues to actually talk to this, which is sort of who always opt out in serial opt-outers, to understand what is driving the decision, because that might actually come up with an idea on how to address it. Genevieve has a question as well. It says, could you share your experience in using member segments and personas to personalize communication? How have you found them effective in tailoring messages to different audience segments? And what strategies have you used to continuously refine these segments and personas based on data insights?
Yeah. So segmentation, of course, is a very classical thing within marketing. I think also the way we saw that evolve is that in the beginning was very much around social demographics. Then for a while it was more about personality. And now it's more segmentation based on behavior. A few years ago, we did a qualitative a study on DC pension communication. And we found that actually the use of segmentation and personas to be a bit mixed. So there are definitely quite some that use it, but very often that segmentation is still very much based on, for example, age only, right? You have the younger and the older, the ones about to retire or just sort of start to build up a pension, and not necessarily very sophisticated segments or personas. For the ones who don't know it, a persona is essentially a sort of archetypical representation of a specific segment. And I also saw very little translation of these personas into more targeted pension communication. And I think that's a little bit of a pity, because I think very often the messages really would differ depending on the situation that someone is, sometimes even the age. I mean, maybe for a job starter, you really want to communicate less and maybe only the most important thing that they need to know at the start of their career, and the rest will come later. So to really think about, okay, what is it that they care about? What is it that they find important? There are, of course, some regulatory concerns here. And I think, at least in the Netherlands, some pension funds are also a bit scared that if they would adjust the communication too much, also in tone of voice or in what they communicate, that they could run into problems with the supervisory bodies. Because you also, of course, not always know for sure to which segment someone belongs. So on the one hand, I really believe in it. I think the benefit is also that, so I know places where they have these personas and they put them up on the wall at the office so that everyone is always reminded, these are our members. These are the people we're doing it for. These are the people we need to keep in mind when we make our policies or when we make our communication. So I think this is a really, really good side effect. And I think there are more opportunities for communication, but definitely also some challenges associated with this.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part. And I read somewhere that in retail, they're trying to take persona to the extreme. So you're like, they're trying to find you. I think probably Amazon and others are very good at figuring out what you really want. But I think it's interesting, because also learning from the mistakes, right? If you do something and get the feedback in, it's a good start. And I think here technology can actually be we're going to see a lot, I think, in the next 10 years. We have a question from Ben. Ben says, I refer my employees to my workplace pension providers' retirement planning tools, which are for free. They like seeing it in real monetary terms and have feedback that is a reality check for them. It's also a provider that maintains jargon-free messaging to simplify the importance of pensions. So there's another employer who actually like to say, well, no one really knows what the nominal value of money is. You want to see it in today's money value. And that sort of, and I like that approach, because it's sort of, it makes it more tangible.
Yeah. This actually sounds more like a best practice example rather than a question, but I think it's very nice. I agree that actually these tools, they can work very well, because they can really sort of visually show what you can expect, or in some of the tools, you can also play around with your expected expenses that are derived from some. So in the Netherlands, we have also Dutch Institute for Family Household Finances, and they know exactly what we spend our money on. So they pre-fill it in, but you can also adjust it. So you can see, okay, this is my expected net monthly retirement income, because that's most insightful for people. And then you can contrast it to expected expenses to see if you're on track or not. I think these type of tools can work really well. And I like that the employer is involved. I think that also works much better than only communication from a pension fund, because people have a more trusted relationship with their employer. And I think it also fits their duty of care and you know, being a good employer to actually help people with their financial planning also for the future. So, and jargon free, great example.
Yeah, I think that is one of the easy wins for everyone, because pension isn't that difficult, and sometimes we just need to keep the actuaries, the lawyer, and the investment people kind of away from the communication.
You know what? Maybe as a side note, the challenge is if there are very difficult actuarial questions, then often the board members not that experienced with that, they shut up. But with communication, you know, it's often that everyone sort of has an opinion because we all communicate. So I think that, and I've also seen often enough that then really good suggestions come from the organization, and then the board says, yeah, but I think, or I feel, or I want. And that's, I think this communication is also an expertise, and that would also be good. I think this appreciation in the board, and also that communication people have the right mandate, and that they are empowered, that they are eye on eye with the lawyers, and that they can fight. Okay, understand that we need to sort of also provide this to, you know, to really be in line with legislation, but let's do it in the second layer, or, you know, that they really fight it out. And I think that's often not the case.
I think that's a very important point, and I've seen it as well, that communication, everybody can have an opinion, and then you actually have to say any trustee or board member is a sample of one, and you need to say we need to find something that works for most people. And I think that is a true challenge, and I think it's also good for communication people to actually push back when the board members come with their helpful suggestions. We have a question here from Marina, which says, "Dear Lisa, we in Canada Pension Plan, the main government contributory program in Canada, are trying to communicate about survivors' pension and how to combine it with your own retirement. And the later members claim their own retirement pension, the more they will get in combined pension. So if you defer your pension a bit, you're going to get a higher amount. So the optimal age to claim retirement is age 68, but the majority tend to claim it at age 60. I think it's optimal from an actuarial perspective. You get most bang for the buck if you went up to 68. What will be your advice on how to communicate this better to members? Any examples or good practices? Thank you." So that's a really good question, Lisa. How do you communicate a relatively complicated problem, but it's really valuable for people?
Yeah. I like the question, and I definitely want to give it even some more thought beyond the time that I have right now to think about this. I mean, first of all, I think it's also good to talk about survivor pension, because often we just, also now we talked about pensions and someone's own retirement income, but the survivor pension is often a very important aspect of it as well. And that's another great hook that you could also use in communication, maybe also around life events like a marrying or getting a registered partnership, because you probably want to make sure that, you know, your loved one is taken care of should something happen to you. So that's more in general. My first thought is that I would probably try to work with anchoring, and really also having in providing the showing people the information. I don't know if tools like the one we talked about before, if they exist, but if you sort of show and you start from this optimal age at 68, and then they can see, okay, how does my own income and the survivor pension income change if I would retire earlier or later. Then it would be shown as a loss. And we know also from research that losses loom larger than gains. So probably that would definitely be less attractive than if you just sort of leave it blank and they can just click anywhere, or you start at the lowest possible, and then they can see how it increases. So I would probably try to work with these insights from behavioral economics and how you visualize the information, on also what you sort of put forward as an anchor.
Thank you, Lisa. We have another question from Alex here, which this is a question I've been thinking about as well, so I'm really looking forward to hear your answer. How often should we be communicating and engaging with our members? And what would be the tipping point of too much?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, maybe it's also a bit sort of the Dutch background. I think here in the Netherlands, we often tend to think so it's actually two questions. So how much should we communicate, but also how much engagement do we even want, right? And I think initially I always thought the more engagement, the better, especially because the engagement is so low and the sort of base rates, opening rates of newsletters, etc. are so low, the more the better. But in this qualitative study that we did some years ago, we also got some very interesting input that maybe too much engagement is also not really good. So if people maybe are too involved, it could also lead to very myopic behaviors. For example, in schemes where you can also withdraw some of your money from a pension scheme, then maybe people are too involved and they check all the time how the investments are evolving. Maybe if there is a shock, they also react too quickly to that, and that would also not be good. So I think it's actually a really good point. Probably there's some kind of optimum, and I don't know exactly where it is, but you also don't want them to be too enthusiastic. But I think it's probably still a long time before we're there for most people. But with this communication, I think it's also important that we just now always said communication, but of course you have the required communication. I guess that's probably in most countries also the case, at least in Europe, that's regulated by IORP too at the moment, that you're obliged to actually send them this annual overview where they see how much they've accumulated, the expected retirement income, and then all kind of additional information as well. But then, of course, you also have from magazines to newsletters to other forms of communication, right? And I think there's no generic answer. I would really, again, approach it a bit from this customer journey and really think about, okay, what are moments when we want to be present, when we need to be present, and how to ensure sort of the flow of communication, because also communication helps you in brand building and creating this trust and connecting.
I think one reflection as well, if you get information when it sort of matters to you, you tend to open it. If you get like a weekly letter from your pension provider, you tend to put it in the trash, right? So it's sort of, you don't want to become spam. You need to be there when it matters to someone. And if it doesn't matter, you probably shouldn't send it.
Yeah. And I think it's also actually, I did also like 20 years ago, I did some work around research and the quality of online research back then. And what I remember also from there is that the timing of when you send an invite to participate in research really matters. So there are really times of the day and days in the week when these invites are more or less successful. And I think that's also here, that's also something to think about, right? When you know that there's maybe a sort of holiday and then people are either just back from holiday and then they're swamped with hundreds of emails, they're not very likely to read the pension email, right? Or if they are sort of in a rush to really go into vacation and to tick off all the emails that they have, not a good timing. And I think sometimes there's these moments when you just know this is not a good moment to reach out to people. So I think proper planning over the year and good timing and sequencing of these different communications is also crucial.
And we have a question here from Kimberly. She says, I love the idea of distilling the information down to the basics for members and understanding what's important to the audience. How do we work with colleagues who is not in communication, who prioritize providing all the information at an expert level to members versus simplifying the information? How can we educate them to focus on what members need versus overloading them with information?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's more about educating your colleagues with a different kind of background and less appreciative of communication, right? I mean, send them to one of our education programs. I would say that's always a good one. We have one together with ICPM at the end of the year, and I think it's really this. Also, in these other fields, they sometimes so detached from these members, right? They're really sort of working in their niche on, I don't know, whether it's in the actuarial or investment or whatever. But and I think that to really it requires, I think, a cultural change also a bit in the organizations. And of course, to do that, you also need the board level support. So probably I would sort of start there and try to achieve that, and then think about how this can also be achieved in the rest of the organization. But what you describe, I think, is exactly what needs to happen.
And Lisa, I working in this environment, been exposed to this, and I would probably say something quite brutal, and that is, not everybody is meant to write communication. In the same way as a communication person is not expected to do actuarial calculations, you shouldn't expect an actuary to do communication, but you need to have the people on the communication side who can translate what the expert says into normal language. And I think that's probably a good step in any organization, realizing communication is a skill of its own and it should be treated as that, and therefore not everybody is able to do it. I'm going to give you a final question here because we are actually quite close at the time. A lot of people are typing questions in, but David has a question here. Says, in the UK, we have a regime that draws a big distinction between advice and guidance. Advice is highly personalized and expensive. Guidance is bland and high level. Given the support you describe, Lisa, is a challenge in the UK. What is your advice for overcoming this?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, David. Thank you. And that's something that I've thought about quite a bit also in the last half year, because it's also traditionally it's also a challenge in the Netherlands. So if you use the word advice, then normally the first reaction that you get is, pension funds are not allowed to advise. But of course, this is a product-specific advice for which you need a different certification or qualification to do that. What actually pension funds are allowed is to provide more generic advice and tell people, okay, what the options are that they have and what they could really do about this. Last year, because this whole topic of choice guidance in the Netherlands got a lot of attention last year because our the legislation, but also then our supervisory body, they changed the norm and they moved towards an open norm choice guidance. And there they, first of all, it's less like a checklist. It puts much more responsibility at the pension funds, but it also really opens it up for doing much more than just providing information, or even more so, they say now, just providing information is not sufficient anymore. You need to guide people in making these choices. And so it's, unfortunately, the publication is in Dutch, but maybe Google Translate can help. We put it down as a spectrum, because if you come from information and you have product advice here, which you cannot give, there's quite a lot of room in between. And there are quite some things that you can actually do in helping people making better decisions. You can interpret it very narrowly, just, okay, these are the 4 choices you have in our plan, and these are the advantages and disadvantages about it, and do you understand the trade-offs? But you can also, and there often tooling comes in, you can bring in the broader financial situation, also from a possible partner, to have a bit more of a holistic perspective, and also see more, okay, what are then, given this information, then maybe decisions you could take, or factors that matter. And there's even one pension fund in the Netherlands. It's a rather unique one for the medical specialists. Of course, they also pay a lot of money for it, but they even have financial planners as employees in the pension fund who help the members. So in the Netherlands now, this spectrum really opens up, and they also see that a lot more can be done. And we even expect also that, so on the one hand, we see that there are concerns about, okay, but what if I say something and it turns out to be the wrong advice? But then they could also get into trouble if people say, okay, but you know, I took a decision that determined my retirement income for the rest of the life, and you didn't do enough to really help me in that decision. And so I think that's really the spectrum in which now a fund has to decide where do we want to position ourselves.
Thank you, Lisa. You've been very good answering a lot of our questions. So now it's time for you to ask a question. And the next guest for Pioneering Pension happens to be me. And my colleague David Bird is going to interview me. So what question would you like to ask me?
Yeah, Stefan, very nice. First, I was thinking of asking you more generically about, okay, what do you see as sort of the big issues in the pension domain in the upcoming decade? But then, given also the discussion we had today, and of course my passion for pension communication and choice guidance, I think the question I would like to ask to you is more, given now the knowledge that we have about the challenges in activating people, but also the knowledge that we have about, okay, what are things that we can still do about this? The challenges that are in the organizations to really do this, it requires a culture change. And how do we manage? What is necessary to really bring that about?
Thank you, Lisa. That's a good question. And I have some time to think about it until 5th of June, 2 p.m., when we're going to have the next episode of Pioneering Pension. With that, I would really like to thank you, Lisa. You have brought a lot of light on our thinking. There's a lot of questions we haven't been answering. So we're going to pick them up and see if we can get back to people on that, because they were also very, very good. And I also would like to thank everyone in the audience for being here and asking the questions, because it's so important that we get the questions from different areas. And now my cat is part of the show as well. But with that, everyone, I would like to thank you all for participating, and a big thank you to Lisa for sharing your experience. And it's always so interesting to learn what other people are doing and how to communicate better. And it's one thing we can do in pensions, or need to do in pension, is to become much better at that. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and looking forward to see you again on the 5th of June at 2 p.m. UK time. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.